Across Newcastle and the Hunter, 2NURFM 103.7 on a Tuesday morning. Every couple of weeks we catch up with our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Josephson. Firstly, Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Mark.
No huge surprise that only a few days after the passing of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, the new king will be riding into town, so as to speak, King Charles III. And that will mean a whole lot of things, particularly even right here in Australia. Let's crack it open and have a look at it.
Well, Mark, the obvious one is that the position of head of state will change in the sense that when the king visits Australia, when the monarch is in Australia, they are the head of state for the duration of their stay. When they're not in Australia, when they're back somewhere else in the world, most usually the Great Britain, the Governor-General is the head of state. So in many respects, our head of state hasn't changed at all. It will only change as it does when the monarch is in town, and then they become the head of state, as I said, for the duration.
Yeah, and already a little bit of chatter that we may see a visit from King Charles in 2024, I think. So that'll be here before you know it. So in a way, manner of speaking, I mean, we haven't had a lot of major events happen. Imagine 1975 with Gough Whitlam. I mean, if the Queen was here, it would have gone through the Queen.
Had she been in
Australia at the time,
she would have been the person who may or may not have made a decision. I suspect she would have, in her constitutional role, deferred to the advice of the Prime Minister. Certainly, I doubt that she would have consulted a Justice of the High Court, and in Sir John Kerr's case, he consulted two Justices of the High Court in consolidating his view of what he was planning to do. I doubt that that Queen Elizabeth, had she been in the country, would have done any of those things and would have waited until she was safely out of the country. That doesn't deny the fact that there was some, shall we say, exchanges between the palace and the Governor-General over that particular issue, but exactly what the Queen herself, as the constitutional monarch, may have been involved, that's another thing. Stuff was in the correspondence was said in her name, but one needs to sort of take a step back from that. In addition to that, we also need to separate the institution of the monarchy from the person who happens to be sitting on the throne at the time. And criticising the institution of the monarchy is not necessarily a criticism of the incumbent.
And vice versa too.
Yeah, and vice versa. So it's also an interesting phenomenon that our understanding of the Queen as a person, that's shifted over, several decades. At one point, towards the end of the 20th century, particularly around the death of Princess Diana, there was quite a bit of negativity towards the royal family, perhaps spilling over into the institution of the monarchy as well. And certainly in Britain, Republican feeling was rising a lot at that particular time, and the royal family was perceived as dysfunctional. The Queen was seen as, a well-intentioned mum perhaps, but she was presiding over a family that was perhaps not ideal, like many families. That negative perception towards the end of the 20th century, we fast forward now to where we are, not counting the Queen's death, but come back a couple of years before that. Her public perception, the perception of the Queen, is entirely different. She had moved from this sort of negative space into one in which she was regarded as sort of very much a matriarch, very much almost a grandmotherly type figure. And basically her popularity went up as she gradually managed to keep her kids out of the public limelight. And even with the scandal surrounding Prince Andrew, that didn't rub off on the Queen. She managed to sort of weather that very effectively. So the monarchy wasn't necessarily damaged by that, nor was the person of the Queen. Whether King Charles is able to, no pun intended, but ascend to the status that his mother achieved, That remains to be seen. He may be the monarch, but he may not be beloved in the same way that his mother was.
And this is a time will tell question. You mentioned that journey of the Queen just has taken over those couple of decades, and like I said, a bit of a change there. Prince Charles, obviously, the world's old. He has now gone from the world's oldest work experience kid to the person that's been able to, granted, have stood in the Queen's shadow and watched how she handled event after event, and in the case of family, scandal after scandal too. And also that interesting idea, Jim, of that there's the person and then there's the institution. Now, as he steps into that role, I think many will find some comfort that he's actually, at least at this early stage, saying, well, all of the things that yes, I've been an activist and for this view and that cause in the past, I now have to leave that to roughly quote him, in the hands of others and move into this new responsibility. So I think if he is able to do that and carry out the duties that in a similar vein, it's got to be hard. I mean, how do you follow an act like that? But if he can at least move in that vein, I think he's in the right track.
Well, he's had a good role model in many respects in terms of understanding what commitment to service, duty to the country and that sort of thing. In some respects, King Charles, when he was prince, received a lot of unfair criticism and a lot of lampooning for some of his views, many of which have subsequently come to be, if not mainstream, then certainly not out of the ordinary, particularly his views on the environment and what we needed to do to improve our relationship with our environment, to save the environment in effect. So he was sort of, in some senses, pushing that a long, long time before it became much more mainstream. And he took a lot of flack for that.
Oh, he did, but I think a lot of that flack comes down to it's not the role, or it's certainly not perceived to be the role of the royal family to be an activist in that way. Well, like the Queen probably had, well, as she was a person, she probably held private views on a whole range of things, but we never really knew what they were. That's the role. And if he steps into that role and continues on that vein, great. Although it's going to, I mean, now that you've got this long history of like, I'm into this, I'm into that, I'm not into that, it's very hard for people to kind of divorce that in some sense.
Well, I think in some respects, for people who are very concerned about climate change, having a monarch who has some understanding and sympathy towards, the problem of climate change is probably going to be seen as a good thing. Charles will understand, I think, that he steps out of the fray. Mm-hmm. As prince, although he's not an ordinary citizen, he is not the authority of the crown as such. He's an apprentice, as it were, as you said.
Yeah.
But now that he has ascended the throne, he then occupies a different space in public stuff. No doubt, as the Queen certainly would have done on occasion, in being consulted by her prime ministers at different times, she may well have expressed a view about this or that. But the tradition and the practice of a constitutional monarchy as established in Britain and as flowed on to Australia for the time being, basically is the Queen acts only on the advice of her Prime Minister, or the monarch has to act on the advice of the Prime Minister, no matter what their personal view or opinion might be. And basically it's the Prime Minister's will that is expressed by the monarch in, the opening of Parliament, for example, or in official functions. So Charles, in his role as king, will do much the same sort of thing, whatever his personal views might be. No doubt prime ministers, including the new one, Liz Truss in Britain, are going to be aware of Charles's views of the past, and they will probably need to factor some of that in order to build a good working relationship with the new monarch. How it will unfold in the future remains to be seen, because although there's a unity happening in Britain at the moment, built around an outpouring of grief for former Queen, there's not a lot of unity when all that dies away. There's a lot of division, fractures, all sorts of problems within the British polity that may fall on Charles's shoulders as the monarch to help try and mend and bring together. At the moment, it's being held together by the grief, and everyone's sort of, we're all in this together, etc. What will it be like in 12 months' time when all of the grief is now a memory, and the reality of King Charles and the reality of Great Britain's place in the world at present, particularly its relationship with Europe, etc., all of that hasn't gone away. That's still a problem for the British government and to some extent for the British monarch.
All right, let's see how he goes. I'm sure he'll be mentioned again, and we wait with some interest the reign of King Charles III. Our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Jose, will talk to you next time, mate. Have a great fortnight.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark. See you in a fortnight.
All right, there he is right here at 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.